I will let everyone know as you are coming in. If you see a pop-up that says choose a different room, please ignore that pop-up. We've been noticing this technological glitch in Zoom, so just ignore it. If you are here for intersectional erasure, this is the correct room, so just disregard any pop-up notices that say choose a different room. We will start in just a few minutes once we get people in the room who are being moved in one at a time. Well, welcome. Let me go ahead and get us started with introductions. My name is Dr. Julie Antilla. I am one of the faculty members in the School of Education at Seattle Pacific University, and it is my privilege to serve on the Diversity Committee and to be part of this conference and to have the opportunity to introduce this session. This is room 3 of our second concurrent sessions. The title of this presentation is Intersectional Erasure, Disability Justice, Racial Equity, and a Call to Action. Our speaker today is Christiana Obey-Sumner. Christiana Obey-Sumner is CEO and Principal Consultant of Epiphanies of Equity, LLC, a social equity consulting firm that particularly specializes in social change, intersectionality, anti-racism, and disability justice. For 2 decades, they've dedicated their life and career to amplifying the importance of social equity, defined as the lifelong work of deconstructing inequitable sociological impacts and products such as policies, institutions, cultures, biases, and constructs, and facilitating strategic and embodied pathways towards the construction of equitable processes, accountability structures, and outcomes. As we welcome Christiana Obey-Sumner, I also would like us to acknowledge Alice, who is going to be our technical assistant in this session, and she will be monitoring the chat as well as helping as needed with technology. So now let us welcome Christiana Obey-Sumner.
Hello, everyone. To the earlier question, yes, can share slides. Super excited to see you all. My name's Christiana Obey-Sumner. My pronouns are they, them. Thank you for that introduction. You may see a small dog going around, but hopefully he will not be too disruptive. And I'm excited to share some more about intersectional erasure, disability justice, racial equity, and a call to action. As we chat today, if you have any questions or there's anything that is sort of resonating with you and coming to mind, please feel free to share that in the chat. And there may be some questions I ask, but also in this format, do not feel obligated to have to share, although sort of reflection and discourse is greatly appreciated. So first I want to just do a little bit of an introduction and some framing around how we're going to chat about this today. This is our really 3 really huge topics. And so it's a high level overview, high level to the stratosphere, which is sort of the tongue in cheek of this background photo. There's a lot of information that's both historical and continuous, meaning this is not, this is not necessarily new, yet perhaps emerging. And it will continue to have, be bound on to change and to flex as time goes on. It's also important not to assume um, homogeneity. Sorry, coffee is still kicking in. But essentially, this is sort of what I know from my experience, both as an organizer, as a city commissioner. I was co-chair of the Seattle Commission for People with Disabilities for 4 years, and also as a consultant. And before I was a consultant, I worked in a direct social service, specifically in housing justice. And so a lot of this is coming from that constellation. And there are so many different sort of lived experiences and perspectives out there. So this is not meant to be homogenous or universal. The hope is that this will be a small part of your journey and work, and that from this, something might pique your interest to go towards lifelong learning. And again, before we get to the meat and potatoes, I want to talk a little bit about that lifelong learning and the small part of your journey piece. The goal of this workshop today is to help facilitate a space and to provide information that may move towards you working towards an adaptive intuition in some of these areas and sort of disrupt reactive performance to equity in these areas. Or another way I like to explain it is how to have the ability to disrupt and solve issues backward. And so that statement, reasoning backward, comes from one of my favorite books since I was a child, of which you can see is a huge designation, as you can see behind me. But Sherlock Holmes, the books have been one of my favorites. And in the first book, A Study in Scarlet, Watson asks Sherlock how he's able to solve mysteries. And Sherlock responds, quote, "Most people, if you describe a train of events to them, will tell you what the result would be. They can put those events together in their minds and argue from them that something will come to pass. There are few people, however, who, if you told them a result, would be able to evolve from their own inner consciousness what the steps were which led up to that result. And this power is what I mean when I talk of reasoning backward." The reason why that resonates so much with social justice and social equity work is, if you really think about it, in so many ways, we're living in a world of continuous results. So when we talk about the importance of dismantling and disrupting inequitable policies, and systems, and institutions, and histories, etc., we must also hold a both-and mindset, especially in this particular conversation, that all of these things are the products and the results of people. It is the actors in these systems and the institutions and across history that have designed or perpetuated or upheld or protected or dismissed or ignored or even passively accepted these policies and systems and status quos and expectations and assumptions that we seek to dismantle today. If the Civil Rights Act, for example, was to be a turning point for inequity, that was only 56, 57 years ago. I mean, that's living memory. For example, our current president was 22 years old when it passed. And the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed only 30 years ago. I'm older than that. And then disability justice came into the world in 2005, and that was only 15 years ago. So I say all of this to have two takeaways before we get to the meat and potatoes of this as our framing. The first is that this is both a very long, huge, multi-century issue, depending on if you believe some of the areas of critical race theory. Some folks say all the way back to as much as 600 years ago. And 56, 57 years, right? Since the Civil Rights Act. So it's important to hold the both end of that. This is neither a sprint nor a marathon, it's a relay race. So we must recognize and learn from those who passed us the baton, who taught us, who we stood on the shoulders of. And we also must work together for an effective, collective, and sustainable pathway forward for that period in time when it's our turn to pass the baton. The second takeaway I want to give before we leave is that it is really, I truly believe, and I'm open to being proved wrong, that to be able to memorize and sort of file all of the hundreds, if not thousands, of tools and frameworks and concepts for when this particular moment comes is also impossible. Again, to make fun of my book addiction, you can see that I've tried that and I don't think it's possible. So the goal today should not have an intention. that you will leave with a laundry list of when you face XYZ scenario, you do ABC thing. The goal should be that we can start to move towards developing foundations and tools and frameworks so that at any time and in any moment, you'll be able to find the most applicable and strategic solution by reasoning backwards, which will require innovation, deconstruction, growing pains, and active lifelong work. So my intentions for your takeaway today is that you can leave with a new tool, fortify some of your current tools, or use the information for when you're in a space to sharpen and rotate your tools in the future. So first, I think what's important is before I can tell you about disability justice, I need to explain why it is not disability rights and how they are sort of bound on each other. To say it, to give a sort of loose metaphor or comparison, we can think about disability justice to disability rights the way that perhaps we can think about Black Lives Matter or Indigenous sovereignty or other sort of racial equity liberatory frameworks to the Civil Rights Act. The disability rights movement was created between 1964 up to 1990 and beyond. It's because when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, there was a lot of communities that were sort of left out, and the disability community is one of them. The movie Crip Camp is a great resource for seeing the process of the disability rights movement. But essentially, it was a movement to establish civil rights for people with disabilities. But there, in the 1970s, there was a sit-in for Section 504, and then by 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, was ratified. Now, the difficulty with any rights-based framework, to be honest, is that it's usually based on universal policy, which can be translated into an equality model, which means that we're going to be dealing with some of the symptoms, but perhaps not the root causes, especially because there are certain things or certain experiences or certain elements of ableism or systemic oppression of disabled folks that may be in an intersectional space, and rights-based frameworks often tend to lack an intersectional analysis. Also, especially if you read, say, Being Human, the Judy Heumann story, one of the founders of the disability rights movement, or watch the movie Crip Camp, you will see or read or hear that a lot of the ways that the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed and then maintained since was through legal precedent case law, so that rights-based framework. We also have to think about who has had access to that, especially during the time period we're speaking about, which is the 60s, 70s, 80s, and early 90s. Disability justice is a liberatory framework that was created in 2005, right after the re-ratification of the Americans with Disabilities Act, primarily because while that re-ratification did expand the definition of disability and what it could possibly mean and how it could be applied, it really didn't get to the gist of what some of the barriers or bottlenecks to equity has been for disabled folks at these different sort of intersections, like how it actually practically impacts folks on the ground. So this liberatory framework is based on 10 principles that are meant to intentionally be fluid and dynamic. And it's also sort of based on a concept of centering those with wisdom and not simply knowledge. And a way to explain that is that knowledge is something that anyone can gain, and it's also never ending. It's sort of chasing the dragon, so to speak. You can read and you can train and you can be in space and you can gain a huge wealth of knowledge around a subject. And it's only through really truly interacting and embodying those concepts and theories and terms that you will have the wisdom of what it means to be applied in the real life practical context. And so that wisdom of centering those who both have the understanding and theory, of course, the scholarship can always be learned, but also has that practical lived experience and embodied wisdom to bring out the fullness and richness of some of the bottlenecks and barriers that folks face. The 10 disability justice principles I will walk us through them because some of them are sort of words that we may have heard about, sort of buzzwords, but they really do have a meaning in this space. Um, the first one is intersectionality. Intersectionality in this case is closer to the original intention and not the more contemporary intention. And let me explain a little bit about what that means. The original intention of intersectionality was created by a legal scholar named Kimberly Crenshaw. Kimberly Crenshaw was a Black woman who was doing some research in the 80s around compounding impacts of different identities of marginalized, oppressed, and exploited folks and communities. There was an automobile manufacturing company where Black women were complaining that they were not able to find work and there were no Black women in there. When Kimberly Crenshaw went to go research them, they're like, oh no, we totally hire Black women and we hire Black folks and we hire women. So I don't know why these Black women would say we don't hire them. So when Kimberly went to go investigate in her inquiry, she found that they did hire Black folks, but they primarily hired Black men for back of house line assembly sort of warehouse work. And they did hire women, but they primarily hired white women for front of house customer facing administrative work. So in this situation, there was a compounding impact of inequity at the intersection of Blackness and misogyny. So there was an anti-Black misogyny or misogynoir, which is Noir at the end. So misogyny towards Black folks. The current contemporary intersectionality understanding is sort of, one or two, I mean, two or more intersecting identities that you may have and sort of the analysis or discourse around the extent to which they negotiate with each other as you move around in space, which is very important. But, some would argue that's more around a social or narrative identity development than the sort of original context around two or more compounding and intersectional impacts of oppressed, marginalized, or exploited communities. So it's closer to that particular definition than the more contemporary one, which, as we will talk about a little bit further later, is a very important distinction. Leadership of most impacted is definitely a little bit intuitive, but essentially this is talking about that wisdom versus knowledge. So to have the most impacted folks, the fullest understanding of both the scholarship and the lived experience at the center and leadership of essentially everything, not only issues around disability or other sort of intersecting communities or compounding impacts, but everything from policy to HR, all of these different sort of places where obviously disabled folks will be around. Anti-capitalist politic is always that stickler one that people are sort of start to clutch their pearls a little bit, but let me explain a little bit about what it means. Anti-capitalist politic can be understood at the intersection of economic and labor justice. So if you think about, say, someone who would have to apply for SSDI, it would require someone to have to break down their lived experience based on their level of productivity and labor, which is one of the founding building blocks of when folks talk about class analysis, which can be seen as anti-capitalism as one of the biggest sort of ways that labor is exploited. You think about the Fair Standard Laborers Act, where they still have certificates where organizations can appeal and pay disabled folks a sub-minimum wage. One of the most notorious of this is Goodwill, who have been caught paying disabled folks as little as pennies on the dollar for the same work that other folks being paid minimum wage would be had. So this anti-capitalist politic is really trying to get to that disabled folks should not be sort of seen based on and sort of have their worth be based on the extent to which their body minds can produce labor, instead to reframe our understanding around productivity in labor, which we are having more of that conversation within non-disabled communities since the pandemic. But it also is the reason for this being continuous and historical, in that this is a conversation, say, around 4-day work weeks, work from home, and the extent to which folks have time for their being able to process between meetings, say. It's something that has been a conversation for quite some time. Commitment to cross-movement organizing is also a little intuitive, but in particular, in disability rights, this is also something that was a piece we talk a lot about. Um, oh, their name just left my head, but Bobby Lomax. Bobby Lomax was a Black Panther who was disabled, a wheelchair user, who was a part of the disability rights movement in the 1977 504 sit-ins. And the Black Panthers even had mill trains for that month plus of the occupation of federal buildings, and also provided caretaking for folks. Today, it's important to think about sort of the cross movement organizing, and we'll talk a little bit about how that happened last year at the intersection of Black Lives Matter and Black Disabled Lives Matter. Recognizing wholeness essentially goes a little bit back to that anti-capitalist politic that no person is a broken person, that everyone should be seen in the full constellation or the full spectrum of the prism of who that person is. Sustainability means that anything that is to be a disability justice initiative should be sustainable for everyone involved. A good way to think about this is sort of a comment I heard from another disabled person who does this work is that you should slow down to the slowest person and let them lead, which would help to make it the most sustainable for everyone involved. Commitment to cross-disability solidarity is definitely one that for disabled folks in the room, they may have had some experiences for, but it's also good to know as folks in solidarity with disability justice, that just like any other equity framework, whether it's race, whether it's gender, whether it's class, whether it's size, whether it's language justice or environmental justice, folks have different opinions, different lived experiences, and therefore different priorities and what they think are the most imperative pieces. In disability justice, it's important for us to see sort of our shared horizon of understanding and our shared equity covenant, which is to abolish ableism and all things flowing into that space. We will talk a little bit about invisible disabilities later and how folks with invisible disabilities sort of face additional challenges, but that those sort of challenges is also based in sort of a being believed or affirmedness within disabled spaces. And so this is saying, there's no such thing as because one disability is more visible than the other, that one is more, one is more of a real disability or an affirmed disability or anything like that. But believe me, there's definitely folks who sometimes either implicitly or explicitly make those cases. Interdependence essentially means that we're in society with each other, and that in being in society with each other, we need to work with each other and help each other in sort of our shared liberation around things. This is also where collective mutual aid has come from, which has also exploded in popularity with the pandemic. But as you can read in the book, Care Work has been in place in the disability justice community for quite some time. Collective access means that everyone should be able to access all parts of an initiative, especially disability justice is in the center. This also goes to the principle of universal design, that if you were to create not just a spatial environment, but also a social environment, a professional and organizational environment, and all other aspects of the environments in which we move and interact with each other in society in ways in which that folks would naturally be able to access it without having to ask for accommodations, that would be more in line with an equitable space than one where folks would have to sort of be accommodated. So a good example of this that folks have argued with, for example, is sort of the process of getting accommodations in the workplace and having to go to get a doctor's note to sort of prove themselves, which is its own sort of process that I don't know if a lot of organizational leaders or HR managers think about. The labyrinthine process of getting a doctor's note for anything. But also, some folks have said if we know that sort of the way that folks sit in chairs all day is unhealthy, and that an ergonomic chair would be better for anyone, not just someone who would need it for an accommodation, then why not have it be a budget item to save to get everyone an ergonomic chair? And would that always work for everyone? Not necessarily, but would it provide perhaps a elimination of a barrier for someone who would have to otherwise ask for it and then be singled out in the office for having a different chair for everyone else? Absolutely. It also would mean something like language justice, having things like captions or notes after meetings, other sort of pieces that folks who would not need that accommodation would only benefit. And finally, collective access and collective liberation can be simply understood by the old adage that none of us are free until all of us are free. So to sort of recap the difference between disability rights and disability justice, disability rights can be seen as sort of individual legal rights to equal access and reasonable accommodations, is there in quotes, because there is a lot of contention around who gets to decide what is reasonable and if that reasonable accommodation goes back to that anti-capitalist politics, so to speak. Based on the Americans with Disabilities Act and other supporting laws. So some things to think about with disability rights, although disability rights is very important, just like the Civil Rights Act is extremely important. And at the same time, it's also important to think about sort of if it's based on policy changes, then who would have access to be able to make those policy changes? If case law and precedent, such as litigation, is required to change disability rights, then who would have the resources to be able to do that? And if it's going to be based around the Americans with Disabilities Act and its applications, we really need to critically think about whether or not the Americans with Disabilities Act, as it is written and it is implemented, covers intersectional equity issues such as these. Disability justice, on the other hand, can be considered as a framework that seeks liberation beyond sort of the equality-based or rights-based sort of paternalistic system, so to speak. It is going towards a world where disabled folks have a right to control and have autonomy of their body, minds, their lives, sexualities, gender, work, and other intersections. It is centered around the leadership of those most impacted. It is required to be sustainable, intersectional, and interdependent, and the primary goals of it would be collective access and liberation. Three other sort of vocab terms to sort of make sure that we know as we go forward is number one, invisible disabilities, which essentially means disabilities that you don't wear out loud. And these can be lived and or embodied experiences of physical, mental, sensory, psychological, developmental, neurological, intellectual, and or chronic impairment in daily and regular activities, but you won't see it. It also might be because someone is masking, which we'll talk about later too. Intersectional disability would mean how the lived experience of disability as embodied or as a social identity unfolds as it's intertwined and compounded with other social identities, and especially those that are worn out loud, such as race, gender expression and identity, class, sexual orientation and identity, citizenship, country of origin, indigeneity, and so forth. And then finally, a multiply disabled person is a person with two or more disabilities that create some level of chronic impairment in daily or regular activities. This latter one is really important, as there are some folks who say could be neurodivergent, but they can be multiple pieces of that. It is important to think disability as both and not either or, as well as not to see it as sort of a prescriptive lifestyle. I saw a meme yesterday within a disability space where someone wrote that they believed that disabled parking spots should only be valid between 9 to 5, because why would a disabled person be outside after 5 p.m.? And so it's important to think about also how we construct an archetype disability as we move forward with this as well. So intersectional erasure, I'm gonna explain as well as racialized ableism, where intersectional erasure in this space happens quite often. First, ableism itself as a term means bias, oppression, marginalization, or any other sort of barrier to participation and access regarding lived or perceived impairment or disability. Racialized ableism, to that point, would be compounded harm, violence, or bias at the intersection of racism or ableism. And like I said, other sort of identities play a part as well. So gender, size, color, tone, and class often play a part in this. So that intersectional erasure would be seen as apathy or lack of regard for the whole person and a hyper focus on select identities within an intersection, and is often a result of confirmation and or anchor bias. To sort of define those quickly, confirmation bias is the tendency for us to seek out, remember, and interpret information that confirms our standing beliefs or perceptions. A good way to think about confirmation bias is if you've ever been sort of in an argument, whether it's online or not, and someone asks you to sort of back up your argument with some sort of resources. So you go, say, to Google and you look up an article and you have three choices. You either have the choice that perhaps is the first link that's there, you have a choice that perhaps is the most popular link that's there, or you find a link that is going to confirm the argument that the person wanted you to find the resource for. The reason why the first two might be important is because it may be a challenge to your current perception, and it could help you to think critically about it. But of course, most of us have definitely went for that third option in the past. And when we have, that's confirmation bias. A softer idea of confirmation bias, say in terms of HR, is if you see someone who you may have otherwise felt a little about, but perhaps you see that they went to your alma mater or they were part of your fraternity or part of your honor society. You start to change your perception of them a little bit, and that would also be confirmation bias. Anchor bias is when the first or most salient or impactful memory or understanding or introduction to a topic is sort of what we compare everything to from that moment forward, which can be really difficult because, of course, sort of the first introduction or the most salient introduction to something may not necessarily be what it is when you start to expand your awareness. But this is also unconscious or implicit, meaning that if we first learned about Black, Brown, Indigenous folks as dangerous, then even with all the training and sort of the conscious thinking in the world, you know, it will likely still lead to perhaps a somatic response in that anchor bias. I always say there's the part of our brain that thinks, and there's the part of our brain that thinks about what we think. And that we really do have to focus on the part of our brain that thinks, because the part of our brain that thinks about what we think is very well versed in some of the things that we should do. But the autopilot, when you're on your fourth Zoom call and it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon and your coffee's wearing off and you have to pee, is going to be the part that comes out. And so that's why it's so important. The picture that you see here is a picture of Matthew Rushin. Matthew Rushin is a Black autistic man who was coming home after work and was buying some Panera bread pastries. There is a thing within neurodivergent spaces called pedal misapplication, which essentially you say hit the gas instead of hitting the brake. When Matthew Rushin was leaving the parking lot, He had a fender bender with one car and then left the parking lot so that he could turn around. In his haste around turning around, he hit another car where someone was seriously hurt. And when the police came to sort of see what was going on, Matthew Russian was having a meltdown. A meltdown is something that autistic folks may have when there is a lot of sensory sort of pieces and there's a lot of things going on. A sort of, if you we think about autistic meltdowns as young kids having a tantrum, can also be sort of anxiety or look a lot like a panic attack. And that is sort of what Matthew Russian did. It also is a space where folks are not really thinking with the brain that thinks about their thinking. They're just sort of thinking. And in that space, folks are very vulnerable to suggestion. So that's sort of what happened as Matthew Russian was going through the legal process. He was separated from his parents, who were caregivers for him. Although he had went to school, he had been working, he had been winning awards and sort of living independently. But he was still sort of living with his parents. So after some of those suggestive conversations, it was finally suggested he sign a plea deal, which he did. And that plea deal led folks to believe that it was intentional vehicular manslaughter, or attempted, and that he would be put in jail for 55 years. Now, it became very obvious to the family, who thought that the plea deal would allow him to come home and for them to have some time to process that was not going to be the case. And they also realized that Matthew didn't really know what was going on when he called his mom shortly after being put in prison and asked her to bring Thanksgiving dinner for his new friends. After the Black Lives Matter movement happened, some folks started to research and call for the case of Matthew Russian to be reopened. And one of the researchers, who said that the evidence in the case, which they said was intentional, that he was trying to commit suicide, and that he was sort of having this sort of attempted vehicular manslaughter, presented strongly that it was pedal misapplication as the primary collision factor, which is a common cause of crash collisions among those aged 16 to 20, which he was, and those with poor executive function, as is common in autism and ADHD. So it became very evident that the collision was an accident. And this researcher wrote, quote, Matthew made a mistake. Would we criminally penalize a driver who fainted, who had a seizure but didn't know they had a seizure disorder, who had an allergic reaction? Is it a crime, a moral failing, something worth removing from someone their freedom to make a mistake as a direct result of having a disability? Or is it that being Black and disabled makes a mistake a criminal offense? In this case, the argument is intersectional erasure, in that we focus so much on the fact, oh, not we, not the collective we, but the sort of space in this, and perhaps the we of public opinion before the sort of calls to action, saw Matthew Russian more in sort of the archetype, or really the stereotype, of scary Black man than we saw as a autistic, neurodivergent Black man who was having a meltdown and feeling in the sort of space of something that was really traumatic. And as my grandma used to say, if you see a situation and you could change the race or the skin tone of the person at the center of the situation and have even an inkling that the outcome would be different, it's likely you're dealing with a racist situation. As a matter of fact, there was a research article that came out only since the Black Lives Matter space, where Cornell University did a study, and they reached out and interviewed 9,000 people born between 1980 and 1984. And they found that in general, people with mental or physical disabilities were 13% more likely to be arrested as juveniles or young adults than people free of disability. But for Black folks, disability widened the chances of arrest by 17%. And they found as part of this study that more than 55% of Black folks with disabilities out of those 9,000 was arrested by age 28, which is horrifyingly high. The Aaron J. McCauley, who was one of the policy analysis and management doctoral students at Cornell University who did the study, said, quote, "It almost makes the experience of arrest fundamental to the experience of being Black and having a disability when more than half of the groups experience arrest." So it's important to think about the ways in which, for example, how this person's rights as a disabled person was violated and how disability justice in this instance could have helped, to sort of ponder on the intersectional issues and where the ADA or an equality versus equity approach may have helped or where it would have fallen short. And also, where are the pain points in the work that you're doing of applying equity and justice frameworks such as these within already existing systems that are based on rights-based models, such as the legal system, housing systems, employment systems, and other sort of institutions. It's also important to think about intersectional erasure in different sort of models of disability. There's quite a few models of disability. We're only going to talk about 3 of them today, but the medical model is perhaps the law of the land, so to speak, in terms of how we regard disabled folks. And so while I think discuss these, it might be helpful to think about the model that your organization or workplace has most ingrained and what sort of cultural, social, and historical reasons it's still there. The medical model of disability is sort of thought of that the disability is caused by some sort of disease or trauma or disorder or something that is wrong or broken with the person. So it individualized disability down to the person. It's also seen that the folks who have disabilities are not able to be a part of society or to live full, independent, and successful lives. And that it is folks who are seen as of the authority or purview, such as physicians or nurses or other healthcare professionals, as the ones best qualified to make key decisions about health issues. It's also disabled folks are sort of seen as these sort of tragic stories, folks who have folks who are sort of these poor things. We can see sort of the inspiration porn, as a lot of disabled folks put it, when we see, say, like a person with Down syndrome it has a great voice, or a person who has prosthetic limbs wins a marathon, and we say, "Oh, see, they're such an inspiration." At the beginning of a pandemic, there was a very short-lived ad where they had folks of various physical disabilities and sensory disabilities putting on masks, and then they had a slide that says, "If they can do it, then you have no reason not to." The rehabilitative model, which is as kind of based off of this, is sort of the medical model, but it has that element of, if you just try hard enough, perhaps you won't be disabled anymore. This is sort of that space of, well, have you tried yoga, acupuncture, the keto diet? Maybe if you tried hard enough, you wouldn't be as disabled. I personally, I think one of the first times that my spouse saw the rehabilitative model is when we told our landlord that I was disabled and it was hard for me to be able to stand without my heart rate shooting up over 125. And when the landlord came over to make a repair, he stood in front of me for over 90, like I felt like over a minute and a half, maybe 2 minutes, beckoning me to stand so that I can prove to him that I was getting better. Yeah, that really happened. The social model of disability has been since the most the most widely shared sort of like replacement to the medical or rehabilitative model, but it's starting to come a little bit out of vogue, and I'll explain a little bit why. So the social model is essentially saying it's not the person who's disabled at the core of it, it's society that's disabled. It's a socially constructed consequence of society's apathy or disregard or lack of awareness or concern for disabled folks and how they have to move around in space. So this is also where I say universal design really got very big, and sort of seeing that it is society that is creating a system of inequitable barriers and bottlenecks to access to participation or community integration, or sort of living your life as fully as you need. And that it is sort of the consequence of an environment created for those who are the most privileged, which in the United States context at this time would be, primarily able-bodied, cisgendered, heterosexual white men, right? That, who are straight sized and not people of size and all these different sort of things. Now, the reason why this model is starting to come out of vogue is because the social model was primarily created by folks who were wheelchair users and with other physical disabilities or mobility impairments. So there is a back, sort of an answer back of, even if there was universal design, I may still need an accommodation because I might still be disabled, especially those with chronic illnesses or neurodivergence or neurological disabilities or other sorts of disabilities where even if there was ramps, or curb cuts everywhere, you may still need a wheelchair to get around, or you may still need to have, perhaps a different mode of transportation, even if all transportation had wheelchair lifts, so to speak. It also sort of encourages disabled folks to see any barrier to access or participation as a social environment issue, but there may be some of these intersectional pieces that may challenge that. So the model that's sort of coming on, or one of them, because there's the human rights model, but the holistic model is sort of that every it sort of has the disabled person be the leader and sort of be the person who has the final say on what the archetype around their experience is. That every disabled person's lived experience of disability is rooted in their understanding, their experiences, and their circumstances that's informing their disability or impairment. That they are more descriptors of a person rather than sort of a value judgment of a person or an intrapersonal fact that this person is disabled. It just is sort of like, any other sort of descriptor that you would have for someone else without it having to be sort of the only real thing that a person is known for. And it is also rests solely within the disabled person, whether they see their disability as something negative, something positive, something neutral, or whether they see it as a disability at all. It also allows for folks to have conflicting disability needs that happen both in the social space and within themselves. What this means is, let's say you have, say, restless leg syndrome, but you're also an ambulatory wheelchair user. You need to use a wheelchair, but you also can't sit in it for too long. And folks should be able to have a conflict with things like that. I have an interesting, say, disability conflict where I can't eat too much sugar or else my blood sugar will spike, but I need to have some sugar or else my blood sugar will plummet. And so how do you navigate some of those tensions? But it also does allow for folks to sort of negotiate those spaces, and calls for society to be open and willing to see the wholeness of someone's lived experiences with this. It also allows for folks to have all those other intersectional parts of one's identity become part of how they construct the building blocks of their archetype and persona. A website, autistictick.com, said about the holistic model disability, quote, "This model takes into account every single part of the whole because every single part influences and shapes the whole." Or as the great Audre Lorde says, we're not single issue beings because we don't live single issue lives. It is important to consider the both and not the either or. Disability is neither visible or invisible. This is a picture that is a picture of mine. I'm the one holding the straw. And this was sort of an organizing meeting at the City Hall with the Disability Commission and other disabled folks when the straw ban was coming on. It was important because folks thought that those who needed straws were only those who fit certain stereotypes of who we think about needing straws, but everyone in this picture was someone who depended on straws. And for different reasons why, alternatives to straws, beyond plastic straws, for each of the folks in these pictures was not a good alternative, or perhaps not even alternative at all. So it's important to think about sort of the full constellation of things, and that's part of recognizing wholeness. Some examples of invisible disabilities may be psychiatric disabilities, traumatic brain injury, epilepsy, HIV or AIDS, diabetes, chronic fatigue syndrome, sleep disorders, ADHD, learning disabilities, heart conditions, or multiple chemical sensitivity. The reason why bias and archetyping and constructing is coming in is because those biases and stereotypes and assumptions really play a huge part in intersectional erasure, particularly for those with these invisible disabilities. It's because it's sort of, we know what we know, out of sight, out of mind, right? We have this tendency to have these social environmental cues. We see a cane or we see a wheelchair, and we sort of automatically process that as this person's disabled. But without those things, we sort of automatically assume that they're not. Example of this is that I have a sort of a disability that is leading to deteriorating mobility. And so while that was happening, in the beginning of it, as a transit user, I would have my disability card that said I should have a seat, but it was very rare for folks to listen to me or care if I asked for a seat. When my disability progressed to a place where I needed to use a cane, it was almost instant when I came onto the bus that people would stand up to give me a seat. And that's sort of that priming that I think it's important for us to really grapple with and start to deconstruct. Some of these things that you see up here are sentences or quotes from things I've either heard or been told in the past that folks assumed about a person with an invisible disability, without thinking that the person was disabled. And a lot of times it had to do with the fact that perhaps they were a marginalized gender, they were a Black, brown, Indigenous person, they were a person who was of younger age. And so they're like, oh, you're too young to be sick, which yes, people say that openly to people. Um, and so they assume it must be some other sort of character flaw or personality flaw. Some examples, I won't read all of them, but some of the examples are like, well, this person fails to finish assigned tasks when the person has ADHD. Or this person has difficulty understanding when they have a traumatic brain injury. Or the one for autism, nonlinear thinking, or this person has nonlinear thinking or processes, was actually one of the uh, was a line of feedback that I personally received on my employee review when I worked at a local hospital. And even though I had FMLA paperwork in place, seeing someone having difficulty working independently was for learning disability, or being in a fog as someone with lupus or chronic fatigue syndrome, or especially if you work, say, in retail, someone who may take frequent long bathroom breaks who has IBS might be seen as someone trying to shirk on the job. So it's important to think about the ways in which we may start to assign bias or blame based on stereotypes and assumptions. Now you might be thinking, well, why don't folks just tell them then? Why don't they just broach the subject? Well, also it's important around disability, especially at the intersection of disability, justice, and racial equity, around intersectional erasure, is that these are two communities that have both systemic and historical trauma. That means that they're both have a history of these systems of oppression, marginalization, and exploitation, harming them, their elders, and their ancestors. and they are currently concurrently facing contemporary issues of oppression, marginalization, or exploitation. So there would have to be a foundation of trust and rapport for someone to want to broach the subject or disclose their disability. And really, you would have to think, especially as someone who may be in leadership or facilitation of a space, whether you have created a space and work towards building enough trust and rapport for someone to feel safe enough to broach the subject with you. Some of this data, this comes from the Harvard Business Review, talks about how if we think about the federal workforce, and this is from 2018, that 30% of the professional workforce fits federal definition of having a disability. It's really important to think about when this is, because we won't know until after this pandemic how many disabled folks there truly are. We are hearing a lot about COVID long haulers or folks who are having sort of acquired disabilities from the pandemic. We're also hearing about the ways in which environmental racism are playing a part in folks acquiring disabilities. Everyone from folks in Mississippi or Flint, Michigan not having clean water, folks in Uniontown, Alabama, getting lung cancer due to the runoff of toxic gases, due to unregulated sewage containment, and Asthma Alley in the Bronx that is within sort of a fence line neighborhood or a sacrifice zone, which is sort of a area of town where the runoff or the toxins or the pollutants from, say, highways or power plants or things like that sort of converge in that space. Before the pandemic, Asthma Alley in the Bronx had 7 times the national hospitalization rate and 21 times the asthma hospitalization rate of all the other bureaus before the pandemic. And so you have to think, say, in that case, how, if you have a neighborhood where 1 in 3 or 4 folks have asthma, and then a respiratory pandemic comes through, how that may impact that neighborhood that's primarily Black and Brown. And then on top of that, consider the narratives around it, sort of individualizing it to character flaws or personality traits of those particular communities and how they may or may not have been helping themselves through their behaviors or their cultural practices, but not really giving a lot of credence to how we've created this environmental space, right? And on top of that, there's 62% of folks in this business review, when they went to the different sort of organizations that had an invisible disability. And there's a lot of reasons why people tend to hide their disability at work. In that same study, they talked to those folks who identified as an invisible disability and asked them why they didn't report having invisible disabilities at work. And some of the reasons was because of social conformity or construction, meaning that they feel, hey, you have to, you have to fit in to get in, so they may mask themselves. And masking is essentially when a person, especially a person with an invisible disability, tries to perform well. They try to perform as if they are not disabled because they don't want that sort of stereotype or assumption or bias of disability to impact how people regard them in space. If you've heard the term code switching is sort of when folks who are Black, Brown, Indigenous, or otherwise not sort of an archetypal member of what we consider the constructed status quo, and they sort of try to perform within the constructed archetype of that status quo. So they'll change their language and behavior and beyond sort of the traditional sociological context, but in a way that is oppressive or marginalizing to the true lived experience of that person. So thinking about this intersectionally, if you have the code switch and you have the mask, but you have to go to, say, a doctor and ask for help, then how do you really navigate that space when we know the data around medical racism and medical ableism? Another thing to think about is, say, teasing or harassment. Again, like you talked about, chains of loss or rapport with peers and supervisors, that they may have broached this subject in previous jobs before and they've been burned and now they have past trauma or negative experiences with that. That, they're already in a cognitive load and they have low energy or patience or hope in this process. That they're concerned about bias towards their work performance, which also may lead to a stalled or disrupted career. And a lot of times when people are having to mask or people are receiving those microaggressions can be plainly thought of as those unconscious and implicit biases we were talking about earlier, coming out of your body mind into the interpersonal space. Weathering is a term that is borrowed from geology. When you see the top rock, say it's under a waterfall and there's a dripping sort of motion happening, it demineralizes the rock and it creates these pits. And I think about the rock on the bottom with the pitting as sort of someone's soul, and those drops as those experiences over and over and over of having to sort of validate yourself, affirm yourself, or mask yourself, code switch in space, or otherwise having to sort of stifle or mute, if not sort of invisibilize or erase an intersectional part of yourself when going into certain spaces to sort of protect yourself. As these sort of as weathering progresses, the effect is that it will lead to long-term anger or more hypervigilant anxiety responses. And as you can imagine, especially as it starts to come into the workplace as legacy trauma or as a result or in response of trauma being experienced and harm being or hurt being experienced in the moment, it can be distractive and disruption, not just to that person's social and narrative development, their professional development, and as well as the ways in which they continue to interact and move about space. And it can lead to other sort of micro traumas. In this case, micro trauma could be if they are working in a certain space, say they were working in an open office concept where there was only sort of movable walls as cubicles, and they were hearing other folks talking about them in the open air space. Then if they were to go to another position, they may not necessarily be able to work in another open air space without it being an environmental cue triggering those elements of trauma. So as I said before, some of the impacts at work is that, these employees become emotionally, mentally, or psychologically harmed, or students in a classroom as well, since this is SPU. And that there is a higher likelihood of sort of bias and sanctioning that can happen as folks start to progress in the weathering, which is why it's so important for us to start to recognize wholeness. So even if we were to hold folks to a standard of productivity, any productivity that they would have would decrease without intervention of these sort of processes and the sort of space for folks to build rapport and trust as they're continuing to mask, code switch, and all of the other pieces. It also, absenteeism may increase as burnout increases. There may be bullying and fear among peers or co-workers as it worsens. There may be sort of milieu morale decreases as it becomes more toxic, and it might project onto clients and them to work. These are also warning signs for if you facilitate a space, an organization, a classroom, anything like that, and you start to see these things from a student, it might be a good sort of sign to reach out to that student to see the extent to which they might be getting harmed in that space. It's also important in that feedback to have an impact over intent mindset. It is important to have your intentions, especially for your self-reflection and your own development. But as the G version of the old adage goes, the road to heck is paved with good intentions. What is really important for equity work is the extent to which you're bringing parity to areas of disparity. And that means focusing on the impact of where you may be in that space. So if the impact, despite your best intentions, if the impact is not leading to parity in these areas of disparity, but perhaps even worsening disparity or the impacts of disparity to certain folks, then it's really important to start to move towards strategies or frameworks or solutions or innovations that can start to reduce, disrupt, or, like when I say disrupt, or have a harm reduction approach in your space. It's also important because as folks are impacted, um, people interdependence is really important. And so, as people may leave your space, while the story may be over for you for now, it may not necessarily be true in the future. And what that means is that the social impact narrative of folks who continue to feel harmed in space, even if it's just one time, can lead to tarnished narratives of you and the space that you facilitate, or even the spaces that you organize within, as those narratives of harm disseminate. So, especially as we have seen in the last year or so, as folks are doing more telling of their truth in social space, it's really important to have that impact over intent mindset. If you are a person who is facilitating space, or you are sort of overseeing an organization, or you're in HR, it's important. Some of the things that you can do is to make a commitment across the organization and among all members of that organization's community, and start to infuse disability justice or disability equity pieces across all departments and and at all levels. It's also important to continue education. Folks only know what they know. And so if folks are not sort of being offered the opportunity to gain an awareness of disability justice or even disability rights, then it'll be really difficult to hold folks accountable to practicing those things in the space. So it's really important to have this be something that is routinely a conversation, as well as the intersectional pieces within your space, especially if you're in a position to advance disabled folks, whether that is as an employee, as a contractor, or as an assistant. Do that, and do it intentionally, and especially in sort of the leadership of those most impacted. It is hard to say that an organization is practicing disability justice, or any justice, racial justice, gender justice, for example, if there are not folks with those lived experiences in all areas of your organization, particularly in executive leadership or any board membership. And finally, strive towards universal design, especially beyond any sort of accessibility, and seek to design a workplace that's accessible in nature. One of my favorite examples of a universal design architecture is this photo, in that it still has stairs for folks who choose to have stairs, but interwoven within it is a ramp. It's not that the ramp has to be in the back or on the side or sort of in the fire exit, but that it is in the same sort of entrance space as everyone else. What to do if you're a manager could be to be proactive. Yes, there are some HR laws where you can't explicitly ask someone if they're disabled, but there you can start to ask everyone and have it be part of the practice of what your access needs are. This could be as simple as having in the beginning of at the beginning of any meeting, you ask folks what their name are, or what their pronouns are, or perhaps what they're bringing into the space, to also ask folks what their access needs may be, and to trust someone. The ADA actually doesn't require you to ask for a doctor's note. It just became a best practice that doesn't have any actual like backing in a law or a policy. So begin to move towards trusting folks. I once gave a training where someone said that they would rather have the doctor's notes in place to help for folks who would quote game the system. I asked them to give a percentage of how many folks may do that, and they said no more than 5%, maybe 3. So what they told me is that they were putting a hostile accommodations process in place for 95 to 97% of the people who would otherwise have disabilities. And that is something to say within the person who is making that decision. It's also important to make time and space for folks, especially those with invisible disabilities, so that you can start to build that trust and rapport, and to have check-ins. If you know that there's someone, say, who is neurodivergent, who may not come to regular meetings, to have, say, shadow meetings as part of your desk time. That's what I do with my employees and contractors, as I will have shadow meetings on my desk time that I can flex and flow whether they are able to come to the regular meeting or not. And finally, as we wrap up, If you are a disabled person or employee or student, to look for signals of support from the organization, which would mean the organization would have to show you signals of support. So this is a two-way street. Also, get to know your manager before you start to broach the conversation. You can start to ask some questions about current events or pop culture to start to get a finger on the pulse to whether this is a person who you can trust. Find comrades in solidarity. If you know a peer or someone who can you can confide in, or if you can start a solidarity program to help with witnessing and strategizing as organizations grapple with their equity process. And finally, join or start an ERG or a student group. If one of those programs are not possible, an employee resource group or a sort of student initiative can help to create an empathetic community and work together for change. So with that, I thank you for coming to this. I'm happy to debrief with folks after this if you want to reach me in any of these spaces. And this is also my contact information for any additional conversation or questions, and to leave for those of you, especially right now with how difficult things have been, a quote from the great Audre Lorde, who was also a disabled Black person, quote, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. So with that, thank you for coming today, and I hope to continue this conversation with some of you soon.
Thank you very much, Christiana. It has been fantastic to have you present for us today. Everyone, we have just about a minute before we are called back to the main room. And there should be a note that comes up on our screen pretty soon about that. If you'd like to move straight into your break right now, you are welcome to. We have a break from 1:15 to 1:30, and then we return for our third concurrent session at 1:30. Thank you again, Christiana. Thank you very much.